The Moana Hotel, Waikiki, the night of February 28, 1905. In a second-floor suite at the front of the building, a 76-year-old widow stirs a teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda into a glass of water and drinks it before bed. Within an hour, she is dying. I have come back to this part of the story many times. The widow's name was Jane Lathrop Stanford. She was the surviving founder of what was, at the time, the largest single act of educational philanthropy in American history. The bicarbonate of soda had been laced with pure strychnine. The university president who owed her his job arrived in Honolulu 72 hours later and hired a local doctor who had not seen the body to invent a heart failure diagnosis. The murder verdict on the official record of Leland Stanford Junior University has never happened. The boy died in Florence in March of 1884. He was 15 years old. His parents built a university in his name. The railroad fortune that endowed it had been extracted from the labor of perhaps 15,000 Chinese workers, of whom roughly 1,000 died blasting the tunnels of the Sierra Nevada. The engineer who designed the line died of yellow fever on the Panama Crossing in 1863, age 37, on his way to New York to buy out the partners who had squeezed him out. Andrew Carnegie, in the founding essay of American philanthropy, held the family's gift up as a model of how the wealthy should give. The widow ran the university single-handedly for 12 years after her husband died. She sold horses to make payroll. She took her jewels to London to sell them. She lobbied a sitting president to expedite a federal lawsuit against her own estate. On the 14th of January, 1905, she drank from a bottle of mineral water laced with rat poison. She tasted it in time. 6 weeks later, in a hotel suite in Waikiki, she swallowed a teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda spiked with pure strychnine and died in tetanic spasm. The university did not remove the cover-up president's name from its buildings until October of 2020. The rationale was eugenics, not the murder he had buried. These facts are documented. They are also not the strangest part of the story. This is the story of a Gilded Age railroad fortune and what was, at the time, the largest single act of educational philanthropy in American history, built in memory of a dead son. It is also the story of the widow who kept that university alive for 12 years after her husband died, who was poisoned with pure strychnine in a Honolulu hotel room in 1905, and whose murder the institution she had saved buried for the next century. I want to start in the hotel room. Chapter 1. The Moana Suite 8 at the Moana Hotel, Waikiki, the second floor, far right of the beachfront facade. The trade wind off the Pacific moved the gauze curtains all night. The Stanford party had checked in on the 20th of February. The Moana had opened in 1901. It was Hawaii's first grand resort, 4 stories of Beaux-Arts woodwork and verandas overlooking the beach. Jane Stanford was traveling with her secretary of 20-some years, Bertha Berner, and a newly hired maid named May Hunt. The plan was a long voyage: Honolulu first, then Australia, then Asia, and Egypt, partly to collect for the Leland Stanford Junior Memorial Museum on the university campus. She had a reason to leave San Francisco. 6 weeks earlier, somebody had put rat poison in her drinking water. On the afternoon of February 28th, she took a carriage out to the New Uanu Pali Cliff, the volcanic ridge above Honolulu, where 18th-century Hawaiian warriors had been driven over the edge by Kamehameha's army. She and Berner and Hunt ate a picnic of gingerbread. They returned in the late afternoon. Jane took a light supper, walked on the pier, and listened to Hawaiian music on the veranda. She retired around 8:30. Berner had laid out a teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda on the nightstand. The bottle had been purchased in San Francisco in late January, after the first poisoning. It had not been used until that night. Jane stirred the powder into a glass of water and drank it. She also took a dose of cascara, a popular laxative. At 11:15, she cried out. Berner ran across the hall from the room she shared with Hunt. She found Jane clinging to the doorframe. 3 doctors were summoned. Francis Howard Humphreys, who lived at the hotel, Francis Day, Harry Murray. They arrived within minutes. Humphreys would later testify at the coroner's inquest that as he tried to administer a solution of bromine and chloral hydrate, Jane told him her jaws were stiff. She said this was a horrible death to die. I have come back to those words more than once. A 76-year-old widow, alone in a hotel room on the other side of an ocean, describing her own death in the second person, like a critic. She died at 11:40 at night. Her jaws had clamped shut, her thighs had opened, her feet had twisted inward, her fingers had clenched into fists, her head had drawn back. Then her breathing stopped. These are textbook signs of strychnine poisoning. They are also, in the language of the period, the signs of acute tetanus. But tetanus requires an observable wound and has a much slower onset. There was no wound on Jane Stanford's body. The total elapsed time from the bicarbonate of soda to death was under 2 hours. Humphreys, Day, and Murray were not lightweights. They were members of the Honolulu Medical Society in good standing. None of them had any prior connection to the Stanford family, to the university, or to David Starr Jordan. They had no professional or financial incentive to invent a strychnine diagnosis. They were the doctors who happened to be available when a wealthy white widow at the Moana Hotel started screaming at 11:15 at night. The next morning, 7 physicians performed an autopsy at Queen's Hospital. The territorial chemist E.C. Shorey ran the bicarbonate of soda through forensic analysis. The result was a pure form of strychnine. Trace strychnine was also found in Jane Stanford's tissues. The autopsy findings were reviewed by the broader Honolulu medical community before the coroner's jury convened on March 6th. A coroner's jury of medical experts heard 3 days of testimony beginning March 6th. On March 9th, after 2 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They found that Jane Lathrop Stanford had died from strychnine poisoning. The strychnine, they ruled, had been put in the bicarbonate of soda by some unknown person or persons with the intent of killing her. The next morning, as another steamer pulled into Honolulu, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser printed across its front page that Mrs. Stanford had been murdered. To understand how the woman in that suite ended up there, with a bottle of pharmaceutical strychnine in her bicarbonate, we have to go a long way back, to upstate New York in the 1820s, to a Methodist farmer's son named Leland. Chapter 2. Watervliet. A frame farmhouse near Watervliet, New York, March of 1824. The 5th of 8 children of a Methodist farming family was born in a back bedroom. The family named him Amasa Leland. He would, by the end of his life, drop the Amasa, build a transcontinental railroad, sit twice in the United States Senate, and bury a son. His father, Josiah Stanford, was an upstate New York farmer of modest means and considerable persistence. The family was Methodist, the faith new and ambitious in early Republic America, with a clean line between this world and the next. Leland grew up on land that was good but never wealthy. He was educated at the Clinton Liberal Institute and the Cazenovia Seminary, both in the Upper Hudson region. He read law and was admitted to the bar in 1848. He set up a practice in Port Washington, Wisconsin, a small Lake Michigan town. For 3 years he practiced law there. In 1852, a fire destroyed his law library. I have spent a long time thinking about that fire. It is the kind of detail that, in retrospect, looks like fate. Without it, Leland Stanford does not leave Wisconsin. Without leaving Wisconsin, he does not join his 5 brothers in Sacramento. Without going to Sacramento, he does not meet Collis Huntington and Mark Hopkins and Charles Crocker. Without meeting them, the Central Pacific Railroad is not built by the men who built it. Without the railroad, there is no fortune. Without the fortune, there is no sun in a Florence hotel. Without the sun in the Florence hotel, there is no university. Without the university, there is no widow in a Waikiki suite drinking strychnine in her bicarbonate of soda. A single fire in a Wisconsin law office in the spring of 1852. Stanford left Wisconsin within months. He followed his brothers to California that same year. He spent his first years there in Michigan Bluff, a mining camp on the American River, running a general store and selling miners' supplies. He was a wholesale merchant before he was anything else. By 1856, he had relocated to Sacramento, where he opened a larger wholesale business. Sacramento in the mid-1850s was the gateway to the Mother Lode, a town of muddy streets and corrugated iron storefronts and the financial capital of the gold country. The Stanford store on K Street stocked groceries, hardware, agricultural implements, and mining equipment. Leland's brothers ran the day-to-day. Leland did the books and made the political connections. He had married Jane Elizabeth Lathrop of Albany on September 30, 1850, before leaving for California. Jane was the second of 6 children of an Albany dry goods shopkeeper named Dyer Lathrop. She had been educated at the Albany Female Academy, the women's school across town from the better-known Albany Academy. The Lathrop family was solidly middle class. The Stanford marriage was a standard upstate New York match between 2 families of equivalent station. After the wedding, Leland had left her behind in Albany while she cared for her dying father. They had been married 5 years before they finally lived together in California. In 1855, she joined him. By 1857, he was running for state treasurer as a Republican. He lost. By 1859, he was running for governor. He lost again. In 1860, he served as a delegate to the Republican National Convention, rather than as a candidate in his own right. The Republican Party in California in those years was a fringe operation, the anti-slavery party of a state whose political class was largely democratic and sympathetic to the South. The Civil War would change all of that. By the time Stanford ran for governor again, in 1861, the war had transformed California politics. The state had voted for Lincoln narrowly the previous fall. The Democratic Party in California had split between northern and southern factions. Stanford ran on a hard pro-union platform. He won. He took office in January of 1862. He served until December of 1863. His most consequential act as governor came in early 1862. A Sacramento railroad engineer named Theodore Judah, who had been surveying the Donner Pass since the 1850s, was lobbying Washington for federal support of a transcontinental railroad. Judah needed political cover. Stanford and the 3 other Sacramento merchants who had agreed to back the project provided it. They called themselves the Associates. The public would soon call them the Big Four. They had no idea that the engineer whose railroad they were about to take from him would be dead within 20 months. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. Judah Theodore DeHone. Judah was 35 years old in the summer of 1861. He had grown up in Connecticut, trained at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and arrived in California in 1854 as the chief engineer of the Sacramento Valley Railroad, the first commercial railroad on the Pacific Coast. For 7 years, he had been surveying the high Sierra Nevada. looking for the pass that a transcontinental railroad could climb. He found it. The Donner Pass route, named for the immigrant party that had famously starved trying to cross the same range in the winter of 1846, ran at a maximum elevation of 7,000 feet and made a feasible grade for a steam locomotive. Judah surveyed it on horseback. He drew the maps. He wrote a 100-page prospectus. What he needed was money. The federal government had been arguing for 2 decades about which transcontinental route to fund. The Civil War, which began in April of 1861, suddenly made the northern route possible by removing Southern legislators from Congress. Judah needed California backers who could fund the survey work and the early grading, and who could lobby Washington for the federal subsidy bills he had drafted. He found 4. Leland Stanford, then a Republican Party operative running for governor; Collis Potter Huntington, a hardware merchant from Sacramento; Mark Hopkins, Huntington's partner; Charles Crocker, a dry goods merchant. The 4 of them, recruited in late 1860 and early 1861, incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad on June 28, 1861. The Pacific Railway Act passed Congress on July 1, 1862. President Lincoln signed it. The Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento. The Union Pacific would build west from Omaha. They would meet somewhere in the middle. The federal government would loan the companies bonds for each mile of track laid, at sliding rates by terrain, and grant them 10 alternate sections of public land per mile. By the middle of 1862, Judah understood that his partners were stealing from the company. The mechanism was a shell corporation called the Contract and Finance Company. The Big Four awarded all the construction contracts to a company they themselves owned at marked-up rates, then booked the difference as private profit. The federal subsidies and land grants paid the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific paid the Contract and Finance Company. The Contract and Finance Company paid the Big Four. Judah was a railroad engineer. He had built the line. He had not built the swindle. He fought with his partners through the summer of 1863 over stock assessments he could not afford. By August, they had effectively squeezed him out of operational control. In October, Judah and his wife Anna boarded a steamer in San Francisco bound for New York. He had in his pocket a written option to buy out each of the 4 partners for $100,000 apiece if he could find a New York financier willing to fund it. The route to New York in 1863 ran through the Isthmus of Panama. Steamers from San Francisco to Aspinwall, the Atlantic side terminus, the Trans-Panama Railroad across the malarial low country, then steamer up the eastern seaboard. Judah caught yellow fever on the crossing. He died at the Metropolitan Hotel in New York on November 2, 1863. He was 37 years old. His wife Anna was at his bedside. By the standards of the period, Judah was an entirely ordinary casualty. Yellow fever killed thousands of Americans every year. The Panama crossing was a known hazard. The man who imagined the railroad died of a mosquito-borne disease on his way to try to take it back from the men he had recruited to fund it. The Big Four kept the company. They kept the contracts. They kept the federal subsidies. They kept the land grants. They kept the Contract and Finance Company. Within a decade, they would be among the wealthiest men in the United States. I have read enough of the contemporaneous correspondence to be sure of one thing. Judah's death was not a relief to the Big Four. He had been a difficult partner, an honest engineer in a project that had become a financial vehicle, and his departure simplified their operations. But it also removed the only one of the 5 original principals who could have, if he had reached New York alive, broken them. The railroad was still mostly unbuilt. The Sierra Nevada was still mostly uncut. The Big Four now had the contract, the land grants, and the federal subsidies. They needed labor. They needed it cheap. Chapter 4. The Tunnels. By 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad was 3 years into construction, 60 miles east of Sacramento, and running out of white workers. The Comstock Silver Lode had opened in Nevada in 1859. The mines paid better than the railroad. The men who had signed on for grading drifted east toward the silver. Charles Crocker, the partner in charge of construction, was running out of labor at the worst possible moment, with the line about to climb into the granite of the Sierra. In early 1864, Crocker had begun hiring Chinese workers as a small experiment. 50 men, then 100. They worked well. By the end of 1865, they were the great majority of the Central Pacific labor force. At peak, the company employed approximately 15,000 Chinese workers. Some estimates run as high as 20,000 over the entire project. They were roughly 90% of the workforce on the western half of the transcontinental line. They were paid less. They lived in tents. They paid for their own food. They blasted 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. The longest was the Summit Tunnel at the top of the pass, 1,659 feet of solid granite at 7,000 feet of elevation. They dug it in winter from both ends, and from a central shaft sunk through the mountain itself. The work was done with hand drills and black powder. Beginning in February of 1867, the British chemist James Howden began mixing nitroglycerin on site at the tunnels because the compound was too unstable to transport safely. It killed and dismembered the workers who handled it. At a granite outcropping called Cape Horn, where the line had to be cut into the rock face above the American River, the work was difficult and dangerous. The popular image of Chinese workers being lowered in woven baskets to set charges in the cliff face has been repeated in tourist literature for more than a century. Modern railroad historians, including Edson T. Strobridge, a descendant of the construction superintendent who oversaw the labor, have argued that the slope at Cape Horn was never actually vertical, and that no primary 19th century source supports the suspended basket image for construction workers. Safety ropes for the surveyors who first mapped the line are documented. The construction baskets, by current scholarship, are most likely folklore. How many Chinese workers died on the line is not known precisely. The Central Pacific kept its books on bonds and miles, not on bodies. The most careful modern estimate, per the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, led by the Stanford historians Gordon Chang and Shelley Fisher-Fishkin, is that as many as 1,000 Chinese workers, perhaps more, died from accidental explosions, avalanches, exposure, and disease during the construction. They were buried near where they fell. Some of the remains were later returned to China at the expense of the workers' associations. In June of 1867, approximately 3,000 of the Chinese workers struck. They demanded equal pay with white workers and a 10-hour day. Crocker broke the strike in a week by cutting off the food supply. The workers, dependent on the company for provisions in the mountains, came back. The man who would later endow a university to the memory of his son had, 3 years before the line began hiring Chinese workers, called Chinese immigrants the dregs of Asia. That phrase comes from Leland Stanford's gubernatorial address of January of 1862. The full passage argued that the presence of Chinese in California would exercise a deleterious influence upon the superior race. 3 years later, in his 1865 report to President Andrew Johnson, Stanford wrote that the Chinese workers were quiet, peaceable, patient, industrious, and economical. He wrote that without the Chinese it would have been impossible to complete the western portion of this great national highway. I have no neat way to reconcile those two statements. By the standards of the period, both were politically functional. The Dregs of Asia address was useful in a state where anti-Chinese sentiment dominated white politics. The Johnson Report was useful in a federal correspondence where the railroad needed continued political support for the labor system it had built. Neither statement was meant by Stanford as a personal, moral declaration. They were instruments. What the labor produced by the spring of 1869 was the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. The line had climbed Donner Pass. The line had crossed the Nevada Desert. The line was about to meet the Union Pacific, building west from Omaha at a low ridge in northern Utah Territory called Promontory Summit. The Chinese workers were paid off and dismissed. Most of them never appeared in the photographs of the ceremony. The most famous image of the meeting of the lines, taken by Andrew J. Russell on May 10, 1869, shows two locomotives nose to nose, two engineers shaking hands across the boiler, and a crowd of white men in derby hats. The Chinese workers who had built the line were standing somewhere just off the frame. Hit subscribe if you want the next story. Costs nothing. Takes a second. Chapter 5. The Spike Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, the morning of May 10, 1869. A low ridge of sage and rabbit brush north of the Great Salt Lake. The Central Pacific had laid the last 16 miles of track in a single day to make the deadline. The Union Pacific had laid its last 7. Two locomotives, the Jupiter from the Central Pacific and the number 119 from the Union Pacific, sat nose to nose on a single connecting tie. The ceremony had originally been scheduled for May 8th. A rainstorm had delayed it by 2 days. A pre-engraved gold spike, 17.6 carats, sat in the hands of David Hughes, a San Francisco contractor who had paid to have it cast. The engraved date on the spike was May 8th. The actual date was May 10th. Stanford was given the honor of driving the spike. The hammer was wired to the telegraph. The spike was wired to the telegraph. The operator stood by the key. When the hammer hit the spike, the impact would close the circuit and send the word "done" over the wires to every newspaper in the nation simultaneously. Stanford swung. He missed. The maul hit the wooden tie. The crowd laughed. Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific, who by primary accounts was suffering from a severe headache that morning, took the maul next and also missed. A regular railroad worker stepped in and drove the spike. The operator sent the word. It was the first national mass media event in American history. Tens of thousands of telegraph operators in cities and towns across the country received the single word "done" at 12:47 in the afternoon, Pacific Time. Bells rang in Philadelphia and Chicago. Fire alarms sounded in San Francisco. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished. The gold spike was immediately pulled from the tie. An iron one was substituted for the actual connection. The Jupiter and the number 119 reversed off the tie. The Central Pacific's own ceremonial locomotive, the Antelope, was not in the photographs because it had been disabled on May 5th, when a runaway log on a flat car struck it near Truckee in the Sierra. The Jupiter was a substitute. I want to step back from the ceremony for a moment. The story of Stanford missing the spike is, in itself, a small piece of comedy. The biggest day of the most important project of his life in front of a press corps that had crossed the continent to watch, and the great man swings and misses. But the comedy is doing real work. Whatever Leland Stanford was in 1869, he was not a man comfortable with manual labor. He was a wholesale merchant, a railroad financier, a former governor, and a Republican Party operative. He had not built the railroad with his hands. The Chinese workers had built it with theirs. The man who could not drive the spike was the man who would receive the credit. What followed Promontory was an empire. Stanford became president of the Southern Pacific Company in 1868, which the Big Four had organized as a holding vehicle for the railroad system, and he held that presidency until 1890. He founded Pacific Mutual Life Insurance in 1868. He served on the board of Wells Fargo from 1870 to his death in 1893. He bought the 55,000-acre Great Vena Ranch in Tehama County, which by the 1880s contained the world's largest vineyard at 3,575 acres of grapes. He bought the Palo Alto Stock Farm, 8,180 acres of horse country south of San Francisco. He owned the Gridley Tract in Butte County and a winery in Alameda County. Family wealth in the late 1870s was estimated at $50 million, equivalent to roughly $1.9 billion in modern purchasing power. The fortune compounded across the next decade. Stanford and the other Big Four partners ran the Southern Pacific as a regional monopoly, absorbing or driving out competitors across California, Oregon, Arizona, and into Texas. By the late 1880s, their freight rates effectively set the price of California agriculture. Their political influence in Sacramento was nearly absolute. The state's hostile newspapers, when they wanted a name for the system, called it the octopus. In 1885, the California legislature elected Stanford to the United States Senate. He defeated his fellow Republican Aaron Sargent, a longtime ally of Collis Huntington's, by methods that Huntington considered straightforward bribery. The breach between the two senior Big Four partners never healed. Stanford took his Senate seat on March 4, 1885. He would hold it with a re-election in 1891 until his death. In 1872, Stanford commissioned the English-born photographer Edward Muybridge to settle a question that had been argued for years in the horse world. Did all four hooves of a galloping horse ever leave the ground simultaneously? After 6 years of trial and error with batteries of trip-wired cameras at the Palo Alto Stock Farm, Muybridge captured the sequence on June 19, 1878. The answer was yes. The work laid the foundation for the motion picture as a technological form. The widely repeated story of a $25,000 wager between Stanford and a friend turns out to be myth. Stanford spent something on the order of $50,000 over the years funding the studies. There was, in all of this, one absence. Jane and Leland Stanford had been married for 18 years. They had no child. In May of 1868, 3 weeks after the wedding of one of Leland's nieces, Jane gave birth to a son. They named him Leland DeWitt Stanford. By family tradition, Leland had the infant brought into the dinner party that night on a covered silver platter. When the lid was lifted, the story goes, the baby was lying inside, on flower blossoms. He was 15 years old when he died. Chapter 6. Florence. The Grand Hotel in Florence, Italy, the early hours of March 13, 1884. A boy of 15 had been dying of typhoid fever for 2 weeks. His parents had been at the bedside. The Italian doctors had tried quinine, balm water, meat broth, and cold sheets. None of it had worked. He died at 6 in the morning. His father later cabled Mark Hopkins in California. Our darling boy was taken from us this morning. Leland DeWitt Stanford had been born 16 years earlier, in May of 1868, after his mother and father had been married for 18 childless years. He had grown up the only child of one of the wealthiest families on the Pacific coast. He had a pony, a private narrow-gauge train running from the Palo Alto house to the family stables on a 400-foot track. and a third-floor museum of curiosities in the family's Nob Hill mansion. At 9, he had insisted that his middle name be legally changed from DeWitt to Leland to match his father's. He developed an intense interest in archaeology. He copied hieroglyphics in the Egyptian wing of the Louvre. In January of 1884, in Athens, the family was introduced to Heinrich Schliemann, the man who had discovered Troy. The boy met Schliemann at the right age. He was 15, on his first grand tour of Europe, and he had decided to be an archaeologist. The typhoid contamination almost certainly came from food or water in Turkey or Greece. The first symptoms presented in Athens. By the time the family reached Naples, Italian doctors were treating Leland Jr. for mild typhoid. They moved him to Rome, then to Florence. The disease in 1884 had no effective treatment. Antibiotics were 60 years away. The treatments the doctors prescribed were palliative and useless. He died on March 13th. He was 2 months short of his 16th birthday. What happened next, in the immediate days after the death, has been told a number of ways. Leland Stanford Sr., prostrate with grief at the Florence Hotel, is said to have had a dream or vision of his son. The boy, in the vision, urged the parents to live for others. Sometime afterward, Leland turned to Jane and said, "The children of California shall be our children." The phrase, in slightly varying forms, became the founding mission of what would become Stanford University. Whether the vision was a dream, a seance experience, or a Victorian story the Stanfords later told about a private decision, is genuinely disputed. The well-known American medium, Maud Lord Drake, later claimed she had been the guiding intermediary in the founding of the university. The Stanfords issued an indignant denial in 1891, characterizing Drake as a fraud. They noted that they had met Drake in New York in the fall of 1884, but only after they had already changed their wills to fund the university. The Drake claim post-dated the founding decision. What is not in dispute is that the Stanfords' interest in spiritualism was real. Leland Sr.'s brother, Thomas Welton Stanford, who lived in Australia, became a major patron of mediums in Melbourne and later donated seance slates supposedly bearing messages from Leland Jr. to the university. Jane Stanford herself, in the years after Leland Sr.'s own death, would tell contemporaries that she received guidance about university matters from the spirits of her husband and son. The seance question would haunt the new university and the lawyers responsible for protecting it. I want to step back from the bedside for a moment. There is, in the 1884 Florence hotel room, an old kind of grief. A wealthy family loses an only child to a disease that money cannot stop. The grief is unremarkable in its substance. What is remarkable is what the parents did with it. They had $50 million and no heir. They had a Palo Alto stock farm of 8,000 acres. They had political access at the federal level. Within 60 days of the boy's death, they had begun to draft the founding documents of a university. The embalmed body was returned by steamer across the Atlantic that summer. It arrived in California in the fall of 1884. It was placed in a temporary brick mausoleum on the Palo Alto stock farm, on the parcel of land that would soon become the university campus. The boy, in the end, was buried on the grounds of the school built in his name. The first move was a tour of Eastern universities. The Stanfords sat with university presidents, asked questions about endowment sizes and admissions practices, and tried to understand what an American university actually was. Their primary guide was Harvard's Charles W. Eliot. Subscribing is how stories like this keep showing up in your feed. It is free. Chapter 7. The Cornerstone. The children of California shall be our children. The phrase, attributed to Leland Stanford Sr. in the weeks after the boy's death, became the operative pledge of the new institution. Whether he ever said it in those exact words is impossible to verify. The line appears in family accounts. It appears in the founding document preambles. It appears in every official history of the university. Whatever the original phrasing, the policy was clear. The Stanfords would build a university in their son's name that would be available to the children of the working and middle classes of California. Charles W. Eliot of Harvard advised that the endowment for such a university should be $5 million. The Stanfords spent considerably more. The California Endowment Act, the founding charter, was signed by Governor George Stoneman on March 9, 1885, on what would have been Leland Sr.'s 61st birthday. The grant of endowment from Leland and Jane Stanford was signed at the first meeting of the Board of Trustees on November 14, 1885. The legal name of the institution was and remains Leland Stanford Junior University. The cornerstone of the main quad was laid on May 14, 1887. The date was deliberate. It was what would have been Leland Jr.'s 19th birthday. The main quad of Stanford University is structurally founded on the date of a dead son's birth. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park in New York and the Capitol grounds in Washington, was hired to master plan the campus. He quarreled with Leland Sr. about the placement of buildings and the use of native versus imported plants. He was eased out by 1889. The main quad was designed by Charles Allerton Coolidge of the Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge firm in a Richardsonian Romanesque and Mission Revival hybrid, sandstone arcades around an open court. The entry to the campus, the oval that visitors still drive through today, was reportedly designed in the shape of an ancient Egyptian ankh, the symbol of eternal life, in callback to Leland Jr.'s Egyptology. I have not been able to verify this in any primary architectural document, but it is repeated in enough credible places to be worth noting. The university opened on October 1, 1891. Andrew White of Cornell had been the Stanfords' first choice for president. White declined. The Stanfords then hired David Starr Jordan, 40 years old, then president of Indiana University, a noted ichthyologist who had built a national reputation classifying North American fishes. Jordan was sworn in on opening day. The first student to register, in Encina Hall, was, by his own later account, a 17-year-old applicant named Herbert Hoover, of the pioneer class of 1895. He had been born in Iowa, orphaned young, and raised by an uncle in Oregon, from where he had come to Palo Alto. He arrived intending to study mechanical engineering. He graduated in geology, after working under John Casper Branner, the chair of the geology department. He would become president of the United States. 2 years before the opening, in June of 1889, Andrew Carnegie published an essay in the North American Review titled Wealth, which would later be called The Gospel of Wealth. Carnegie laid out his theory of philanthropy. The wealthy, he argued, had a moral obligation to spend their fortunes on institutions that would lift others. He identified universities as the highest use of private wealth and pointed to the Stanford Endowment as the kind of giving he was advocating. Stanford was, at that moment, in the highest tier of American philanthropic reputation. Jane Stanford added, in 1899, an extraordinary stipulation to the founding grant. The number of women attending the university as students would, at no time, exceed 500. Jane feared the school would otherwise become what she called the Vassar of the West, rather than a fitting memorial to her son. The cap was reinterpreted by the trustees in 1933 as a 3-to-1 ratio of male to female undergraduates. The ratio persisted into the early 1960s. The founding was, on the surface, unusually rich and unusually progressive. The Stanford grant insisted on non-sectarian status, co-education, and a curriculum that combined the traditional liberal arts with engineering and agriculture. The campus was master-planned by the country's most famous landscape architect. The faculty included some of the era's most respected scholars. The endowment was, in nominal $1885, roughly $40 million, equivalent to about $1.4 billion today. The actual cash transferred to the trustees after probate would prove far smaller. That problem belonged to the widow. The founder was 69 years old. He had 6 years left. Chapter 8. The Jewels. Jane Stanford, in a London jeweler's office in 1897, 69 years old, in Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee year. On the velvet pad in front of her is a parure of pearls bought from Tiffany. There are pieces said to have belonged to Queen Isabella of Spain. There is a diamond brooch the size of a child's fist. The jeweler offers a sum. Jane refuses. She tells him the offer is insulting. She brings the jewels back to California. The reason she was selling the jewels was that Leland Stanford Sr. had died 4 years earlier. He died on June 21, 1893, at his Palo Alto home. The cause was heart failure, complicated by locomotor ataxia, a degenerative spinal condition that had been troubling him for some years. He was 69 years old. No serious historian has questioned the death as anything other than natural. The estate was immediately frozen by federal litigation. The United States government, in a lawsuit filed in 1894, sought roughly $15 million from the Stanford estate for unpaid Central Pacific construction loan obligations under the original Pacific Railway Act. The case, United States versus Stanford, was decided by the Supreme Court in March of 1896 in the estate's favor. Probate finally cleared in 1898. During those 5 years, the trustees of Stanford University voted to close the institution. Jane refused. She was allowed by the federal court managing the frozen estate $10,000 a month as a family allowance. She used it to pay the faculty payroll. She closed the family's Vina Ranch. She sold most of the family's racehorses. She closed the Nob Hill Mansion in San Francisco. She dismissed nearly all of her servants, retaining only her cook of 20 years, a Chinese-American man named Ah Wing. She traveled to Washington and lobbied President Grover Cleveland to expedite the federal lawsuit. Cleveland did. She traveled to London in 1897, in Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee year, hoping to sell the jewels to European buyers at top prices. The prices offered were not what she had hoped. She brought the jewels home. She commissioned the San Francisco saloon painter A.D.M. Cooper in 1898 to paint a 4-foot by 6-foot still life of the entire collection. The painting still hangs today in Stanford's Cantor Arts Center. In her will, finalized in 1903 with a codicil in 1904, she directed the executors to sell the remaining jewels and her private railway car, and use the proceeds to create a permanent endowment for the purchase of library books. The Jewel Fund, as it was called, was capitalized at $500,000. It is now valued at roughly $20 million. It continues to buy books today. I have read enough of the surviving correspondence to be sure of one thing. Jane Stanford ran the university for the 12 years between her husband's death and her own. She paid the bills, she raised the money, she made the hires, she made the firings. She fought the trustees, she fought the federal government. By 1898, when probate cleared and the trustees received what some accounts put at roughly $11 million in cash and securities, Jane Stanford was effectively the school. By the standards of the period, this was extraordinary. American universities were run by men. Boards of trustees were composed of men. Faculty were men. Jane Stanford was a 69-year-old widow who told university presidents what to do. The principal one she told what to do was David Starr Jordan. The two of them fought from the start. The first major public conflict was the Ross Affair, named for the sociology and economics professor Edward A. Ross. Ross was a free silver supporter of William Jennings Bryan, an advocate of populist economics, and an unrelenting public racist. He had given speeches arguing that the United States should turn its guns on every vessel bringing Japanese immigrants to American shores. Jane was offended by both the economics and the racism, the second of which she associated with the same anti-Chinese politics of Dennis Kearney that her husband had once exploited. She pressured Jordan to remove Ross. Jordan, reluctantly, asked Ross to resign on November 14, 1900. Ross immediately went to the press, claiming Mrs. Stanford had fired him over Jordan's objection. 7 faculty members resigned in protest. The philosopher Arthur Lovejoy, one of the 7, would later co-found the American Association of University Professors with John Dewey in 1915, partly in response to the Stanford case. The Ross Affair became the first major academic freedom controversy in American history. After the Ross Affair, Jane's trust in Jordan deteriorated. She recruited the German professor Julius Goebel as her confidant and informer. Goebel reported to her on Jordan's hiring favoritism, his political patronage, and what Goebel called Jordan's whitewashing of a sex scandal involving a faculty member in his circle. In June of 1904, Goebel wrote that Mrs. Stanford had reached the point of, in his phrase, the final remedy. The final remedy was the removal of the president. On Friday, January 13, 1905, Jane Stanford met with the Board of Trustees in her Nob Hill Library and urged them to force Jordan out. The next night, somebody put rat poison in her drinking water. She tasted the bitter Poland Spring before swallowing more than a sip. She forced herself to vomit. She survived. The bottle was sent to a pharmacy. The analysis came back Nux vomica, a botanical strychnine preparation used as a commercial rat poison. The dose would have killed her within minutes. A detective agency was retained. The English maid Elizabeth Richmond was placed under surveillance and quietly dismissed. No one was charged. Jane Stanford packed for a long voyage, departed San Francisco for Honolulu on February 15, 1905, and brought with her, packed in luggage, a fresh bottle of bicarbonate of soda. If you are still watching, you are who this channel is for. Subscribe, and these will keep coming. Chapter 9. The Bicarbonate. The verdict took the coroner's jury 2 minutes. Jane Lathrop Stanford had died of strychnine poisoning. The strychnine had been put in her bicarbonate of soda by some unknown person or persons with the intent of killing her. The Pacific Commercial Advertiser of Honolulu, on the morning of March 10, 1905, printed the verdict across the front page. That same afternoon, David Starr Jordan's steamer pulled into Honolulu Harbor. Jordan had sailed from San Francisco on March 4th, 6 days after the death. The crossing to the Hawaiian Islands ran roughly 5 to 6 days under steam. Jordan had time, on the voyage, to think about what he was going to do when he arrived. What had happened in the suite was already publicly established by the time he stepped off the steamer. The bicarbonate of soda, the cry at 11:15, the 3 Honolulu doctors, the tetanic spasm, the autopsy, the forensic finding of pure strychnine. The coroner's jury had heard 3 days of testimony beginning March 6th and returned its murder verdict on March 9th. By the time Jordan's ship docked, the murder was a public fact in Honolulu and, via the wire services, a published fact across the mainland. The first thing Jordan did when he stepped off the steamer was hire a doctor. His name was Ernest Coniston Waterhouse. He was a Honolulu-based physician of marginal reputation, recently arrived from elsewhere, with a personal interest in moving to Ceylon. He had not examined Jane Stanford's body. He had not performed any portion of the autopsy. He had no familiarity with the case beyond what he could read in the local papers. Jordan paid him roughly the present-day equivalent of $7,000 to produce a 4-page report. The report concluded that the cause of death had been heart failure. Waterhouse attributed the death to overexertion during the picnic at the Nu'uanu Pali Cliff, gas from the gingerbread, and Jane Stanford's advanced age. He did not address the strychnine finding in the bicarbonate of soda. He did not address the territorial chemist E.C. Shorey's forensic analysis of Jane Stanford's tissues. He did not address the textbook tetanic spasm presentation that the 3 attending physicians had observed. Jordan, before boarding his return steamer, issued a press release. Jane Stanford had not been poisoned. She had died of natural causes. He elaborated to the New York Times that the death was a natural death, and that the coroner's jury verdict had been written out with the assistance of the deputy high sheriff. The implication, broadcast across the mainland press, was that the Honolulu jurors had been coached. In a letter dated March 22, 1905, written from his return voyage to the new president of the Stanford Board of Trustees, Judge Samuel Lieb, Jordan went further. He suggested that Dr. Francis Humphreys, the lead attending physician at the death scene, had added the strychnine to the bicarbonate of soda after Jane Stanford had died, in order to manufacture a more interesting cause of death after the fact. Humphreys, Jordan wrote, was a man without professional or personal standing. I have read this letter. I cannot read it without registering something close to nausea. Francis Humphreys was a Honolulu Medical Society member in good standing, with no professional incentive to invent a murder, who had attended a dying woman in a hotel suite and watched her die. Jordan, sitting in San Francisco at the head of a wealthy private university, accused him in writing to the trustees of having tampered with the body. When Humphreys confronted Jordan directly, Jordan denied having said any such thing. He never publicly retracted. Waterhouse, the doctor who had produced the heart failure report, abruptly left Honolulu in the late summer of 1905 for Ceylon, ostensibly to start a rubber plantation. Decades later, he died as a transient in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. The San Francisco Police Department, which had been running an investigation since the first poisoning in January, was disrupted in late March of 1905 when Police Chief George Whitman was dismissed in an unrelated departmental scandal. Most of the police case files were destroyed in the April 1906 earthquake fire. Jordan wrote to the trustees offering several alternative explanations for the death and inviting the board to pick whichever was most suitable. The case was officially shelved. Why did Jordan do this? The institutional motive was financial. Jane Stanford had died with the university's founding documents still legally fragile. A murder probate would have opened those documents to renewed scrutiny in open court. The estate was still settling. Major beneficiaries, including Bertha Berner with her $15,000 bequest, would have been locked in years of litigation. The personal motive was sharper. Jane Stanford had been about to fire Jordan. The trustees' meeting of January 13, 1905, in Jane's Nob Hill Library, had been called for exactly that purpose. She had been poisoned the next night. The university president, whose job she had been about to terminate, now controlled the public narrative about her death. She was 76 years old. Chapter 10. Jordan Hall. On October 7, 2020, the Stanford Board of Trustees voted to remove David Starr Jordan's name from 4 campus features: Jordan Hall, Building 420, which had housed the psychology department; Jordan Quad, the Jordan Modulars; and Jordan Way, the road. The David Starr Jordan Prize, the $20,000 honorarium jointly endowed by Stanford, Cornell, and Indiana University, was officially discontinued. The rationale stated by the board was eugenics. Jordan, as Stanford's first president, had chaired the Eugenics Committee of the American Breeders Association, the first organized American eugenics body. He had been a founding trustee of the Human Betterment Foundation, the California organization whose model sterilization laws were studied by the drafters of the Nazi sterilization legislation of 1933. He had argued, in his 1911 book, The Heredity of Richard Roe, that if the fittest in society did not produce children, the next generations would not inherit fitness. He had approvingly endorsed the social welfare reformer Amos Warner's view that the proper function of charity was to allow those judged unfit by heredity to become extinct with as little pain as possible. The rationale for the renaming was that the university could no longer attach its founding president's name to its buildings. The murder cover-up was not mentioned in the trustee resolution. What had happened in the century between Jane Stanford's death and that trustee vote can be summarized in a paragraph. The official histories of Stanford University adopted the Jordan heart failure narrative. Bertha Berner published 2 memoirs, the first in 1934 that elaborated on the heart failure story, while quietly containing claims that later historians have shown to be false. The institutional history written by Orrin Leslie Elliott and published in 1937, Stanford University, the first 25 years, adopted the same narrative. The case faded from public memory. The reopening was, partly, a matter of credentialed access. In the 1980s, archivists at Stanford began to find that the surviving documentation of the death and the cover-up was substantial, including the full coroner's jury transcripts and Jordan's correspondence. In 2003, Robert Cutler, an emeritus Stanford professor of neurology, published The Mysterious Death of Jane Stanford with Stanford University Press itself. Cutler argued on medical grounds that Jane Stanford had been murdered, that the Honolulu physicians had got the diagnosis right, and that Jordan had orchestrated a cover-up over nearly 2 decades. The book's medical reasoning was endorsed in peer review by Boyd Stevens, the longtime chief medical examiner of San Francisco. Cutler did not name a killer. He declined to. He concluded that Bertha Berner had ample opportunity and no clear motive, and that Jordan had clear motive and no obvious opportunity. He finished the manuscript a year before his own death in April of 2004. In 2022, the Stanford historian Richard White, a MacArthur Fellow and a Pulitzer finalist for his 1911 book Railroaded, published Who Killed Jane Stanford? A Gilded Age Tale of Murder, Deceit, Spirits, and the Birth of a University, through W. W. Norton. White argued, by elimination and historical inference, that the killer was almost certainly Bertha Berner. He argued that the first poisoning may have been a botched warning, rather than a fatal attempt. He argued that the San Francisco Police Department had likely suspected Berner all along and had cooperated with Jordan in the cover-up to protect their own institutional interests. Neither Cutler nor White was able to identify, beyond reasonable doubt, the person who put strychnine in the bicarbonate of soda. The case officially remains unsolved. In 2018, the Stanford Board of Trustees voted to rename the Front Pedestrian Mall as Jane Stanford Way. The street designation took legal effect in October of 2019, the year before the Jordan Hall renaming. The action was undertaken in the context of a broader review of features bearing the name of Father Junipero Serra, the 18th century Spanish missionary whose California mission system had been a major engine of indigenous mortality. The Stanford trustees took the opportunity to honor Jane. I want to step back from the chronology. It would be easy to read this as a story about a single institutional villain, David Starr Jordan, covering up a single murder, and about an institution that spent more than a century failing to acknowledge what he had done. That is not what this is. What strikes me, having spent the time I have spent with this material, is that the cover-up was not unusual. It was the predictable behavior of a private institution whose founding documents were still legally fragile, whose probate was complex, whose president had a contract he wanted to keep, and whose trustees had every reason to prefer a heart attack to a poisoning. The cover-up was the standard output of a standard arrangement of incentives. Jordan was the operative. He was not the architect. The architecture was the standing arrangement of an American private university in the year 1905, which protected itself, which would have protected itself in any year, and which still does. What survived is the university, the endowment now in the tens of billions of dollars, the Hoover Institution, founded by the first student to register at the school in 1891, the Cantor Arts Center, where the A.D.M. Cooper painting of Jane's jewels still hangs, the Jewel Fund, still buying library books, the Memorial Church on the main quad, where Jane was eulogized in March of 1905, the mausoleum on the campus, where she is buried between her husband and her son. What did not survive is the murder. On the official record of Leland Stanford Junior University, the October 2020 renaming acknowledged the eugenics. The renaming did not acknowledge the cover-up. The Moana Hotel still stands on Waikiki Beach. It has been expanded and restored several times since 1905, but the original second-floor facade is intact. The suite where Jane Stanford died is still rentable by any tourist. The bicarbonate of soda is no longer kept on the nightstand. I think about that suite often. A woman who had walked the Louvre with her dying son, who had sold her horses to make payroll, who had stood up to a faculty rebellion and a board of trustees and the federal government and her own university's president, died in it on the night of February 28, 1905. The bicarbonate of soda was on the nightstand because she could not sleep without it. The strychnine was in the bicarbonate of soda because someone, on the public record of the Honolulu coroner's jury and in the medical historical judgment of Robert Cutler and Richard White, had put it there. The Moana Hotel still stands. The suite can still be rented. The strychnine, on the official record of Leland Stanford Junior University, never happened. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.